and a pleasure to be speaking to you at Orza and a real honor and privilege to have my name associated with Lucy Davidovich, whose seminal work on the Holocaust continues to reverberate down to the present day. So thank you for the opportunity to share with you last Sunday, this Sunday, and our third installment next Sunday. I think you know, since you were with us last week, I come to you normally from Highland Park, New Jersey, former home of Rabbi Scott Bolton, but in this case, coming to you from Provence in the south of France, in the middle leg of a 6-month sabbatical travels Israel, Provence, and Rome. And it's just been wonderful to explore the rich Jewish history from the medieval period, especially here in the south of France. Our topic, however, takes us instead, not in this location, but rather to Cairo in particular, but with very broad geographical horizons. We all love alliteration. The title at the bottom there, From Canaan to Cairo to La Coruña, and the title of this installment, From Cordoba to Cardamom, and you'll see why I'm calling it that, the world of the Cairo Geniza. What is the Cairo Geniza? Why is it so important to what we do? And what can we learn from this remarkable collection of documents? We start our story here. Before I get to the contents of the Cairo Geniza, as fascinating as it all is, I also want to tell you about how it was all discovered, because that narrative is equally fascinating. This is the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo. It's actually several miles south of modern downtown Cairo, in the old portion of Cairo called Fustat. I can't see everybody's hand, but how many of you have been there? It's an amazing place. It was built at the end of the 9th century CE. So this is the oldest synagogue in the world, still standing and in use. Now, it's no longer an operative congregational synagogue, but it was up until the 1960s, perhaps even to the 70s, with the dispersion of the Egyptian Jewish community to places like Israel and Europe and the United States. The synagogue ceased to function. There are still one functioning synagogue in Cairo, but this one no longer functions. It was renovated in the 1890s. So what you're looking at is the structure from 120, 130 years ago. But the foundations and portions of the bones of the building go back more than 1,000 years. As you can see, the synagogue still belongs to the Jewish community of Cairo. This is the sign on the outside of the building. And it is very much a historical site recognized by the Egyptian government. So there's the data that you need to know, the bullet points. Founded in 882, Maimonides served as the rabbi here in this community, in this synagogue, and we'll be talking about Maimonides towards the latter portion of my talk. I mentioned that it was renovated during the 1890s, at which point it was electrified and all sorts of things, which I'll show you in the next few images again, and it continued in use into the 50s, or as I said a moment ago, in the 60s. After it ceased to be a operating congregational synagogue, the entire building was conserved by the Bronfman Foundation during the years that you see here. And that effort was led by Phyllis Lambert. How many of you know that Phyllis Lambert is a daughter of Samuel Bronfman, and therefore the brother of Edgar Bronfman, still alive at the age of 95. And she is an architectural historian. She is always taking an interest, including in the construction of the Seagram's building on the Upper East Side, and other places in Montreal where the Bronfman family calls home, and took firsthand charge of the renovations of the Ben Ezra Synagogue. So I want to recognize Phyllis Bronfman Lambert, great architectural historian. This is the interior, as I showed you before. Again, you're looking at 1890s now. Upper gallery for the women. Notice the marble, the chandeliers, electrified. This was a wealthy Jewish community at the end of the 19th and into the 20th century. And it's just showing you some of the gilding on the ark and reader's table that you have in front of you. Now, up above, you already see here the railing for the women's gallery. And if we look up, you see an opening in this wall right here. This is the spot where, everybody seated, drum roll, 300,000 documents were found in that little storeroom. Gnizah is the Hebrew word for storeroom. As you know, the Jewish tradition is you cannot simply destroy a sacred text. A Bible, a Torah scroll, a Mishnah, a Siddur, Passover Haggadah, if they become worn or torn or not legible, they are not just tossed into the rubbish, but have to be treated with respect and put into a gnizah. Now, most Jewish communities, I'm sure your synagogue is one of them, saves these documents up and then takes them to a cemetery to be buried on the next occasion when a grave is opened up upon someone's death. That's the usual custom. For reasons we simply do not know, the custom in Cairo might have to do, by the way, with the dryness of the climate and the dryness of the soil. But in any case, in Cairo, they generally did not, we have some evidence, but generally did not bury their old documents, sacred texts, but rather kept them in that little storeroom that you see there. If we go upstairs, we are now looking into the women's gallery. This is my old, now somewhat getting fuzzy photo. Time to go back from the late 1990s when I stood there in front of this. And a couple of diorama kind of pictures of what it must have been like for the Jews of medieval Cairo to climb up on a ladder and to place their no longer needed and illegible and torn and worn documents into that space. This is one reconstruction of it. Here's the more cartoon version of it. So this gives you a sense of what it was like for the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. Generations, centuries of putting documents into that little store space. Now, word of this incredible treasury began to reach scholars outside of Egypt in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and into the 1890s. A trickle of documents started coming out of Egypt, and they began to reach major European academic centers like Oxford, while various private collectors were obtaining documents as well. This was the age when all of the great museum collections, the Metropolitan Museum, the Brooklyn Museum, the Louvre, the British Museum, the Berlin Museum, they were all collecting all manner of material from ancient Egypt. Now, you all live within a few blocks of the Met. So when you go into the Egyptian galleries there, almost everything there came to New York in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. There were no laws, there are today, there were no laws governing the export of antiquities. And that's how these great European and American museums built up their collections. And on the side, from these antiquities dealers in Egypt, you could pick up Cairo Gnizah documents, which were trickling out of the synagogue into the hands of dealers and so on. Amongst those private collectors were two individuals named Adler, no relationship to one another, but you may have heard of both of them. On the left is Elkan Nathan Adler from London. He was both the son and the brother of the two chief rabbis. His father was chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth. And when his father died, his brother became the chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth. So he grew up in a very learned home. He himself was a lawyer and a bibliophile and began to collect documents and amassed through his own visits to Egypt and through intermediaries thousands of Cairo Gnizah documents as they trickled out of that storeroom, which I just showed you there. On the right is Cyrus Adler, an American. If I tell you that he was born in Arkansas, I'm not making that up, but at the age of just less than a year, his family moved to Philadelphia. He's very much associated with Philadelphia. He had a PhD in Semitics from Johns Hopkins and became librarian of the Smithsonian and eventually the president of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. And we'll circle back to JTS a couple of times today. They both obtained documents in the late 80s and early 90s when Cyrus Adler also traveled to Egypt for his own personal use, not in his official capacity as Smithsonian librarian, but simply to purchase. Now, our story takes a new turn in 1896 with these two incredible women, twin sisters, known to us as Mrs. Lewis and Mrs. Gibson. They were Scottish women, daughters of a Scottish Presbyterian minister whose wife died young, and he raised his twin daughters and gave them a full education in Victorian Britain. And what does that mean? That means not just the arts and French, but it also means Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and they kept on going and learned Aramaic and learned how to speak modern Greek and Italian and Arabic and so on. A remarkable pair of twins. They both married to Mr. Lewis and Mr. Gibson, both of whom died young as well, and both of whom were considerably wealthy. And now these twin sisters had some amount of money to go explore the Mediterranean and Egypt and elsewhere in search of antiquity. And they did. They're an incredible story. They went in 1892 to St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai. Now, can you imagine what that journey was? Can you imagine what, like today it's difficult. Imagine 1892. And they made a return visit in 1896. They wanted to study the manuscripts in the library of the monastery. This is a Greek Orthodox monastery. This is where it's located in the southern part of the Sinai. How does anybody get there in the 1890s? You take a ship to Alexandria, you go overland to Cairo, and in Cairo you arrange for your transport, and that transport was 11 days overland by camel caravan. And that's what Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson did twice to go to St. Catherine's. And they took with them all of their equipment, including photographic equipment, old, or at that time, new cameras, metal plates, all of which are still today in Cambridge to be studied if you want to go see the original photographs that they took. And they did remarkable work. Now, their story has been told by Janet Soskis, formerly of Cambridge, now of Duke University, the Sisters of Sinai. In 1896, after their second journey to St. Catherine's, they're heading back to England via Cairo, of course. And when they're in Cairo, they pick up some Cairo-Geniza documents as well. After all, why not? Now, they were friends with Solomon Schechter, and that name is a name we'll hear over and over again, and is probably the single name most identified with the Cairo-Geniza material. The twin sisters, Mrs. Lewis and Mrs. Gibson, had become very friendly with Solomon Schechter in Cambridge for the following reason. They left their native Scotland. They knew they had to find an academic home, and they settled in Cambridge, and that became the center, and that's where they knew Solomon Schechter. We'll talk about Schechter a little bit in just a moment, his career. They bonded over the following. If you don't know this, all of the colleges of Oxford and Cambridge are officially Church of England institutions. There are chapels within each college. Many of the masters of the colleges are ordained Anglican priests. And the Anglican system dominates in Oxford and Cambridge. If you're a woman, there were no women in universities yet. If you were a Scottish Presbyterian, if you were Jewish, you were on the social margins of that academic life, either in Oxford or Cambridge. And so Schechter and Lewis and Gibson sort of bonded not only over their scholarly interests, Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, and so on, but also because they could do whatever they wanted. They were perfectly free to do whatever they wanted, but they couldn't be part of, by their own choice, that Anglican system. Okay, Schechter, born in Romania, educated in Vienna and Berlin, comes to London, and then becomes reader, that's a pretty high-ranking professorial title, of Hebrew in Cambridge in 1890. In 1902, we're jumping ahead a little bit, he leaves England and he comes to New York to become the president of the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he served for the next 13 years of his life. He was replaced by Cyrus Adler, so it's all part of the same group of people. Now, when Mrs. Lewis and Mrs. Gibson obtained these documents in Cairo, they were able to read most of them. Biblical texts they knew in Hebrew, they could read it. Other Jewish documents they knew, they could read. This one was new to them. They could not identify this document. So they showed it to Solomon Schechter when they got back to Cambridge in 1896. Schechter identified it as a portion, this is a little complicated, but I'll explain this, a portion of the Hebrew original of the Book of Ben Sira. Now, Ben Sira was written by a Jewish sage by that name in around 180 BCE. It did not make it into the Jewish canon. It's very similar to the Book of Proverbs, by the way, although it's written centuries later. Ben Sira is a collection of proverbial wisdom, doesn't make it into the Jewish canon, but the rabbis continue to read it. It's cited in the Talmud. It's cited later by Saadia Gaon. So it kept being read by the Jews. It was translated by the grandson into Greek, and it becomes part of the Christian Bible. But eventually, the Hebrew original fell by the wayside. Jews eventually stopped reading it. We have a few verses, as I said, cited in rabbinic texts such as the Talmud. Schechter saw this. Now imagine the genius of the man. And he said, oh, this is the Hebrew original of the Book of Ben Sira. He knew the Book of Ben Sira in its Greek version so well that when he saw this, he realized this was the Hebrew version. It would be as if, example, right? Let's assume, for example, that the writings of Victor Hugo, his French novels, Les Miserables, are lost. And all we have it is an English translation, 2,000 years from now, who knows? And then one day somebody finds a leaf like this, and it has it in French, and somebody says, oh, that's the original French of the work we only know in English. That's the kind of brilliance of Schechter. As my colleagues in Cambridge say correctly, Schechter was the only person in the world probably who would have been able to identify this. He was the right man in the right time in the right spot. And he told Mrs. Lewis and Mrs. Gibson what this was. He took it home with them, by the way. He took it home with him. And then he wrote them a letter, or he addressed it only to Mrs. Lewis, on the 13th of May, 1896. And you can see his very hasty handwriting here. It's preserved still today in the Cambridge University Library. And he says, underlined, the original Hebrew of Ecclesiasticus, that's the way it's known in the Christian tradition. And he's going to come tomorrow and discuss the matter with them. And at the bottom, he says, in haste and great excitement, yours sincerely, S. Schechter. I always like to point out that he says he's going to come see them at 11 p.m. I can't imagine that a gentleman would call on Victorian women at 11 p.m. I assume he meant 11 a.m., but he was so excited, as you can see from his pen marks, that he probably wrote 11 p.m. in error. Schechter now knew, he had heard about this trickle of documents that Adler in London had gotten and some Oxford people had received. He now knew that he had to go to Cambridge and see for himself. And so what he did was he turned to his good friend, Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor, how's that for a gentleman, was the master of St. John's College. He was an Anglican priest, as I just referred to a moment ago, the heads of these colleges, but he was also a Hebraist and a classicist. His Greek and his Latin and his Hebrew and his Aramaic were fluent. This was an educated gentleman, Victorian gentleman, whom Schechter had befriended because of their own academic interest. And St. John's College, by the way, is the wealthiest of the colleges at Cambridge. Taylor was the master or the dean, and he controlled all manner of funds. And basically what he said to Schechter was, if you apply for a research grant from the university to go to Cambridge, it'll take months to get the approval. Everybody will find out about it. Here's the money, I'm giving it to you from our own coffers. Go off to Cairo and find what you can find and bring back as much as you can to Cambridge. As an indication of Taylor's erudition, Taylor wrote a commentary on Pirkei Avot. How many of you knew that a great Christian scholar, Charles Taylor, wrote a seminal work on one of the great Jewish works, Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers. So Schechter goes off with the funds supplied by Taylor. Oh, here's St. John's College, which I mentioned. Not a bad gig, even to this day, of course, to be the master of St. John's. And he goes off to Cairo. He endears himself to the rabbi of the synagogue, who basically says to him, take whatever you would like. And he does. He didn't have to pay for any of it. I know it'll be in good hands with you in England. Take it. Of course, he had to pay for transport to get everything back to England, which he does. And so this is what Schechter did. He climbs up onto and through this, and he looks in, and this is what he sees. Now, obviously, this is not what he sees because this is a modern color photograph. I'm going to show you all the documents in Cambridge in a moment. But the University of Cambridge Library has kept some of this that you see right here to give you a sense of what it looked like when Schechter found it. I don't mean this disrespectfully, but I'm going to say the detritus of the Jewish past sitting in this storeroom, all crumbled up fragments. And there's the quote from Schechter. He wrote a letter back to his wife in Cambridge, his wife Matilda. It is a battlefield of books and the literary production of centuries. And here Schechter invokes the Gary Rendsburg rule of scholarship. Never say it in English if you can say it in Latin or in German. The disjecta membra strewn all over the place. This is what the storeroom looks like today. I never climbed up there on a ladder. I did not ask my host if I could have a ladder, but this photograph was supplied to me by Rabbi Mark Glickman. I'll mention him in a little bit as well, who actually did request a ladder so he could take a photograph when he was visiting the Ben Ezra synagogue. So thank you, Rabbi Glickman, for this photograph here. He thinks he was probably the first person to go look in to the storeroom since Schechter emptied it out in 1896, 1897. Now, Schechter ships everything back to England. And there's my little line of the ship on the Mediterranean through the Straits of Gibraltar, up the Atlantic coast to the port of Liverpool, and then overland to Cambridge. He wired his wife Matilda in Cambridge and said, I'm sending back via ship all of the documents from the Cairo Geniza. Please meet the ship at the port of Liverpool and ensure that it reaches Cambridge. That's my arrow there in the bottom right, I'm going off to Israel to visit my brother. Now, he had not seen his brother since they left Romania. Schechter went off to Vienna and Berlin and then London. His brother went to Israel, an early Zionist communal settlement in Zichron Yaakov, to be a vintner. And many of you have been to Zichron, and my wife and I were just there recently again to see the winery, the Carmel Winery, which is still there. Schechter goes off to Israel to see his brother, whom he hadn't seen in decades. I mean, this is staggering to me. I would never let these things out of my sight, but he trusted the shipping company. After all, the British are so efficient at such things. This is the heyday of the British Empire, and he knew his wife would ensure they got to Cambridge, and everything worked out fine. This is the iconic photo of Schechter in the Cambridge University Library. And look at the crates and look at the documents. And he begins to do the basic sorting. Schechter knew every single text imaginable. He was the greatest scholar of Jewish studies of his day. And so he could go through all of those documents and start sorting, but just by looking at them. Bible, and he probably sorted Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. Mishnah, Talmud of the land of Israel, the so-called Yerushalmi. Babylonian Talmud, Haggadah, Siddur, Machzor, Maimonides, Piyut, poetry, other stuff. He could just sort it, and he does basic sorting for the 5 years that he worked there on this material until he left to go to New York. This is the building which is still standing. It was then the library where Schechter did his work. And in the 1930s, Cambridge built a new, very large university library. Looks industrial, I know. Remember, it's the Depression, not only here, but around the world, including in the UK. But it's a very functional library. And this is the place where the Cairo Geniza documents are kept today. And now they're all beautifully organized in folders. And you see every folder begins with TS, standing for Taylor Schechter. Folders that look like this, folders that look like this, and you can go behind the scenes and you can request, I've been there, but you can request documents that you want to read. They're all cataloged, as I will explain, and they bring them out to you in the reading room. But this is what it looked like 125 years ago, and I've just shown you what it looks like today after more than a century of conservation, preservation, cataloging, organizing, sorting, etc. All told, there were 300,000 documents in the Cairo Geniza. 2/3 of them, the mother lode, Schechter brings back to Cambridge. The second largest collection is at JTS in New York, and then the Bodleian in Oxford, and then Manchester, St. Petersburg, and Penn, and 70 other locations with sometimes just a few documents or a couple of dozen documents or a couple of hundred documents. The JTS collection, FYI, everybody thinks, oh, maybe Schechter brought stuff to New York. No, he did not. The JTS collection was purchased from Elkan Nathan Adler, the gentleman from London whom I showed you earlier. He eventually sold his 30,000 documents to JTS. And the Cyrus Adler material, 2,000, wound up at Penn. I told you he was a Philadelphian. So that'll give you a sense of how some of these private collections wound up in public institutions. All of that is the story of how we got these documents, because the narrative is so fascinating. What do we have? Whatever you want, you can find in the Cairo Geniza. Old Torah scrolls, probably from around the year 800, clearly antedating the construction of the synagogue, because when a community builds a new synagogue, they just bring the Sifrei Torah from where they were to where they are now. This is a portion of Genesis. And here I am reading it in the Cambridge University Library in 2019. So if you see the document that's conserved in these big plastic sleeves, you see what I'm reading. This is this. Because yes, I can get digital images online, as I'll show you, but imagine being able to read it up close. And you need to do both. You can zoom in on the internet, but you can see things only by studying them and reading them up close. In Cambridge, everything is under plastic by now, almost everything. Other places where I have read Cairo Geniza documents don't have them under plastic unless they're in some sort of special care. This is the back of that scroll, just to remind you, it's a scroll, Torah scroll. And here it is up close, just to give you a few lines out of Genesis 14. I want you to think about this. I see it looks like an ark there in the Beit Midrash, and I know you obviously have others in your prayer space and the sanctuary. Can you imagine that 1,200 years from now, somebody's still going to be able to read a pasuk out of one of your Torah scrolls? That's to put it in context, right? That 1,200 years after this was written, we're still able to read it. And so in the year 3200, I'm hoping that somebody will still be reading your scrolls in your congregation in Manhattan. And another fragment actually from the same scroll. The coloration is different, but they actually do come from, I think it has to do with the photography, do come from the same scroll. Bible manuscripts, that is to say, not within a scroll, but rather in the forerunner of the book, what we call the codex. Everything's still written out by hand, but there's no printing yet. And you can see that this has the vowels and the accent marks and everything, which you can't do in a Torah scroll, but you can do in a regular manuscript. This is the beginning of the book of Genesis. If you can read the Hebrew, just starts here, Bereshit, Bara, etc. A manuscript of the book of Samuel. There are tens of thousands of biblical manuscripts and the 300,000. I'm only giving you, this one's in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. I'm only giving you samples. There's only so much I can do in 50 minutes of our time together. This one is also the book of Samuel in Oxford. And you can see the ink is remarkable. These are almost all parchment, by the way. Last week we talked about papyrus and the shift to parchment. Almost all of this is on parchment. Mishnah. I'm going to go through chronologically, starting with Bible. Mishnah, the earliest rabbinic text. This is from Tractate Shabbat. The Talmud of the land of Israel, what we know in Jewish parlance as the Yerushalmi. a Babylonian Talmud manuscript. This one's at Columbia University, which also has a small collection, not one of the larger ones, but a small one. Look how clear the writing is. Use good quality ink, good quality parchment, and you'll be able to read it for 1,000 years. The oldest Passover Haggadah that we have. Ever wonder? I've entitled this series The People of the Book. Do you ever wonder how we even have these things? Right? You just take it for granted that you get to the Seder table and everybody has a printed Haggadah. The Manischewitz version or the other version, you know, Maxwell House, sorry, the Maxwell House version or the other version. Everybody has a printed text. Well, in 1,000 years ago, that wasn't the case. One person, the head of family, undoubtedly the male head of household, had a text and everybody listened. And this is the oldest extant one we have from around the year 900. It's at Penn. JTS has one a little bit younger than this one. And let's read it if you can make this out. Kiddush, I know that looks like a mem sofit, but that's a shin. Kiddush Pesach, Baruch Atah, Adonai Eloheinu, Melech HaOlam, Borei Peri HaGefen. That's remarkable that we can actually read this. And on the next page, can you read Manishtana? Manishtana halayla hazeh mikol halelot, shebachol halelot, etc. I can't see you folks. I'm sorry. I have a picture of the Beit Midrash folks. I hope you have eyes wide open and are in awe of what I'm showing you here, right? This is absolutely amazing that we have this material. You know, what can one say? That we just possess all of this. I want to point out, by the way, that if we go back, this is written by a professional scribe. You can tell. It's beautiful. And most of the things I've just shown you are. Not this one. This was probably written by the head of household himself, not a scribe, who asked to borrow his neighbor's Haggadah Shel Pesach and let me write it out. He doesn't know how to write. He's not a scribe. So Bible and Talmud and those kinds of things are written by professional scribes with good penmanship. And this person just, you know, wrote it out because he needed a copy of the Haggadah for the Seder table. Absolutely amazing material. Let me take a break. I know it's already 4:40. And just ask if there are any questions. We did this last week. I'm happy to field any questions a little bit more than halfway through our time this morning. And I'll give you the warning, I'm going to need more than 11 a.m., but hopefully that's okay. Go ahead. Anybody?
Joe from the Beit Midrash here has a question.
Professor, have there been documented cases of any discrepancies between, for example, in the Torah, what's been found in the Geniza and the modern Torah scrolls we have today?
Good question. And we talked a little bit about this last week, Dead Sea Scrolls, etc. And the answer is yes, nothing major. By this point, the biblical text is really fixed and there is no wiggle room for variation. That wasn't the case at the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, 1,000 years prior to this. So for the Bible, almost no changes, nothing. But for every other text, yes. For Mishnah, for the Siddur, I'm not showing it to you. It would take me, I could do 3 weeks just on the Cairo Geniza. Do you know that from the Cairo Geniza, we have Haggadot, including the one I just showed you, with only 3 questions to the Manishtana. And we have one that has 5 questions for the Manishtana. I could spend an entire 50 minutes just talking about the Haggadot, right? But I'm just giving you the sampling here. So yes, there are all sorts of variations on almost every single text, but not on the Bible per se. Only the most minor little things.
Dr. Rendsburg, I think it would be fair to say at that point it would be a toad sofer, that we would call it an actual mistake of the sofer versus a variation in the actual Torah text by that point, right?
Probably by that point, because this text is so fixed that these would be, especially for Torah, maybe not the book of Samuel or something else, but for Torah, These would almost have to be little slips of the pen. Yeah.
In the chat, there's a question from Mimi or Barry or both. Who has access to these? Can we go to Cambridge and look at the area of the Sidur we're studying in class? Can anyone make application? Can you just arrive one day? Do you have to, have a letter from Dr. Gary Rendsburg saying he's kosher? What?
Hang on 1 minute, I'm going to answer that question. I'm going to give you the opportunity to join me to go to Oxford and Cambridge to look at this material. But let me continue, okay? And we'll come back with the full Q&A at the end. Okay. I mentioned Ben Sira before. There's the original document that Schechter found, the twin sisters found on the left and showed to Schechter. And there's the letter he wrote on the right. More material came from the Cairo Geniza, so much so that I decided with one of my students to co-develop a website called bensira.org. And look, if you can read the smaller print here, these documents are now housed in Cambridge, Oxford, London, Paris, New York, Jerusalem, and Los Angeles and Jerusalem. There's a private collector in Los Angeles, has two folios, a leaf of a manuscript we call a folio of the Book of Ben Sira. I digitally reunited all of that material with my student to create bensira.org. So you can enjoy that in your spare time and just see all of the material there. Other documents, ketubot, wedding contracts. And again, looks just like ours today, which is to say the scribe wrote it out. And at the bottom, all manner of signatures from the various witnesses. Now, according to Jewish law, you only need 2 edim, 2 witnesses. But in these Cairo Geniza ketubot, there are multiple signatures. And if you can read Hebrew, you can make out names. And if you cannot read Hebrew, I assume you can tell the difference between the actual text and then of these various signatures at the bottom. Similarly here, another ketubah. Although I must admit, I think there's only 2 signatures now. And then this one, the longest of them, a fascinating text, because in this case, a Karaite woman marries a Rabbinite man. Most Jews in the world follow the rabbinic system, but the Karaites are a minority position which rejects the Talmudic material, follows their own system, and because a Karaite woman was marrying a Rabbinite man, they had to explain in the ketubah what was going to happen when they have differences of opinion with kashrut and Shabbat and the holidays and so on. It's all laid out here. Thus, for example, if you don't know this, the Karaites do not light Shabbat candles because it's not biblical. And it says in this ketubah that the man cannot force his wife to light Shabbat candles against her will because she was raised in the Karaite tradition and so on. A fascinating text. The trousseau list of a wealthy bride. Now, this is not a sacred text, but it winds up in the Cairo Geniza. You see, it's a list. And this, by the way, is written in Arabic, but in Hebrew letters, what we call Judeo-Arabic. All manner of clothing, silk, linen, very valuable material, jewelry of gold and so on, vases, including Chinese porcelain, vessels, and actual real money, 2,100 dinars, all listed there. We have a prenup agreement. You New Yorkers, you Manhattanites think that you are like so forward in the world, so liberal, so modern, thoroughly modern with your prenups. I'm of course saying all this with a smile. We have a prenup from the 11th century already, 1,000 years ago. Apparently Tovia had a bad reputation and he had to promise when he was marrying this woman that he would behave appropriately to the marriage. An alphabet primer. Did you learn Hebrew just like this? I'm sure you did. Nothing's changed in 1,000 years. Ba, ba, be, be, bi, bo, bu, etc. A letter in Arabic. A draft of a letter to the Caliph requesting that he confirm Solomon ben Judah as the head of the Jewish community. This one's now in the Penn collection. I'm sure that the letter they sent to the Caliph looked much prettier than this, but they wrote out a draft first, and these scribes could write in Arabic. That was the language of the land. and he probably wrote a very careful, beautiful, handwritten version to send to the Caliph, but this was the draft. The actual letter obviously wound up at the palace. We have the draft in the Cairo Geniza. The Bible transcribed into Arabic script. For whom was this? In other words, this is written in Arabic, but this is actually Hebrew. So if you were to read this, it would sound like Hebrew, if you read it aloud. Probably written for a convert from Islam to Judaism, who hadn't learned Hebrew yet, but could at least follow along when they read in the synagogue. And the opposite, copies of the Quran in Arabic, but written in Hebrew script. Maybe for a Jew who converted to Islam, or maybe just because Jews needed to know what the majority culture of the Muslims of Cairo, of Egypt generally, was all about. Now we come to Maimonides.
Well, we're moving along.
As I said, he was the rabbi in this synagogue. He was born in Cordoba. There's my title, from Cordoba to Cardamom. He moved to Egypt. He was the physician to the Sultan, and he was the great scholar of all Jewish law, philosophy, and so on. Because he was in this synagogue, so many of his handwritten materials are found in the Geniza. This is Maimonides' own handwriting. And this is a draft of his Code of Jewish Law. He's writing it out, his Mishneh Torah. And here it actually says his name, Moshe Maimon, belonging to Moses Maimonides, or of Moses Maimonides. His own draft. Are all of your jaws dropping still? I'm hoping so. All of those mouths agape when I show you things like this. This is his draft of his Guide for the Perplexed, his great philosophical work. And notice what you see here. Cross-outs on the bottom left, marginal additions on the right. This isn't just the work of Maimonides, this is the mind of Maimonides at work as he's writing out his Guide for the Perplexed. And then an anonymous report of a visit to the home of Maimonides. Somebody visited Maimonides at home and described it in this little document that winds up in the Cairo Geniza. And you know how you serve tea or coffee to somebody? Well, somebody, presumably Mrs. Maimonides, whose name we don't know, served lemon cakes. You see the bottom line there. As I like to quip, okay, Code of Jewish Law, the Guide for the Perplexed. What I really want to know is, what did Maimonides serve guests when they came to the home? And the Cairo Geniza gives us that incredible insight into this world. Lemon cakes. And remind you, lemons are, like all citrus fruit, with the exception of grapefruit, lemons, oranges, etc., are native to East Asia, to China. But by this point, you could get them in the Middle Ages. We'll come back to that. In the Middle East, we'll come back to that. Maimonides wrote a manual on sexual intercourse because his patient, a member of the royal family, perhaps the nephew of Saladin, was having trouble holding an erection, and he asked Maimonides for help. And Maimonides wrote out the prescription, as it were, to warm the genitals and this and that. And he tells him what he should be drinking. It's a concoction, and you have in the concoction iron water, ox tongue, lemon peel, carnation, and then in the third line, my favorite, 2 rittles of wine. What's the problem? His client, his patient, is a Muslim. Or a rittle of honey for one who does not consider wine permissible. Honey, being more viscous, requires only 1 rittle as opposed to the 2 rittles, some liquid measurement, obviously, of wine. And they speak the same language. When Maimonides writes here in Arabic, may God lengthen his life, he's using the word Allah. Jews and Muslims are sharing the same monotheistic language. How did Maimonides know anything about medicinal plants? How did any physician in the Middle Ages know anything about medicinal plants? They rely to a great extent on classical Greek wisdom, including this famous text on plants written by Nicholas of Damascus in the 1st century BCE. And Nicholas's text, 1,000 years plus 1,200 years later, was still being used in Arabic translation by physicians across the Arabic world and in Europe in Latin translation. This is Maimonides' copy that he owned. He didn't write this. This is the copy that he owned of this. This is his consultation book. As Nicholas describes all the plans. How do we know Maimonides owned this copy? Turn it over, and it says Moshe there at the top. And we know the handwriting so well that we know that this is Moshe Maimonides. Okay, question during our short break is, can anybody go see these materials? The answer is yes and no. If you have the scholar qualifications, you can go. I know all of the people at the research unit there in Cambridge and in Oxford and in all the other libraries in which I have worked on these documents. But I'm going to give you the special opportunity. Please join us. We are leading a tour in this coming summer, July 31st through August 11th. This is the commercial break for our presentation today, with permission from Rabbi Bolton. England as the custodian of the Jewish past, a bespoke tour which I have created with Sababa Travel of Westfield, New Jersey. And we will be spending 12 days visiting Oxford, Cambridge, London, the libraries, the British Library, the British Museum, side trips to Stonehenge, Salisbury, visit to the Globe Theatre, not Jewish connections to these things, but great attractions, Blenheim Palace, Bletchley Park. I will, at the end, put the links into the chat. If you're interested, people have started to register. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I'm in touch with the librarians in Oxford and Cambridge. They have already set aside time for us, and they will bring out any documents that we would like to inspect, including whatever Maimonides material that we want, and coming attractions for next Sunday, the Kennecott Bible, which is the crown jewel of all medieval Hebrew manuscripts, housed in Oxford. So please, please consider joining us for this remarkable and unique experience, this bespoke tour. And now back to the regular part of our program. Your homework, if you decide to go on the tour, I say with a smile always, is to read these two books. Rabbi Bolton told me that the authors of Sacred Trash were speakers at Or Zarua some years ago when the book appeared. And here you have it, Sacred Trash, the Lost and Found World of the Cairo Geniza. I always, and you see the iconic photo there, I always joke with my British colleagues, if a British scholar had written this, or a British pair of scholars had written this, it would have been called Sacred Rubbish, but they're Americans, it's Sacred Trash. And on the left is another book, Sacred Treasure of the Cairo Geniza, by Rabbi Mark Glickman, whose photo of the emptied out storeroom I showed you before, and look at his cover, right? There's the Ba Ba Be Be alphabet primer that I showed you. Both very accessible books that I commend to you to learn more about the Cairo Geniza. Now, I'm going to end with two categories of material. First, a wealth of documentation about the trade with India. There are 500, look in my text box, exclamation mark, 500 documents out of the 300,000 texts relate to the trade with India. What was that about? Well, here's some more of them. Let's look at the map. Cairo is at this time the crossroads of the world. You can sail the Mediterranean, go down the Nile into the Delta and off into wherever you want to go in the Mediterranean, Greece, Italy, France, where I am right now, Provence, the port of Marseille, for example, to Spain, all across North Africa. You can reach anything from Cairo, and all of Europe and North Africa is at your doorstep. In the other direction, you can sail on the Red Sea down to Aden, the port of Aden in Yemen. It's the only natural port, that's why we highlight Aden. And then across the Indian Ocean to India. And this is what Jewish traders were doing from Cairo to the Malabar coast of southwest India. These are the sites that are mentioned in these Cairo Geniza documents. On the right, the sites in India, and on the left, the sites in South Arabia. What were they trading? Well, they were sending to India, in other words, from Egypt, they would send to India paper, books, coral, cheese, sugar, raisins. There are no grapes in India. They would send raisins. Olive oil. There are no olives in India. They send olive oil. Flax. All of this stuff is being sent to India. And wheat, right? There's no great manner of grain other than rice in India. So they're exporting all of this, including in the right-hand column, you can see fancy carpets and so on and so forth. What are they bringing back from India? India is the spice capital of the world. In fact, we in central New Jersey are the epicenter of Indian American life in towns like Edison, which is right next to where I live in Highland Park. And as I like to tell my students, and I say this to my adult students like yourselves as well, you have to think about these things. As I always like to say, cinnamon doesn't come from a little jar, a little McCormick's jar in the supermarket aisle, right? These are all plants that come from India, especially South India. Pepper, the things you and I take for granted on our table. Pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, from Cordoba to cardamom. Turmeric, cloves, ginger, mace, nutmeg. How did the people of Mediterranean live without all of this stuff until the India trade got started? And so this is what they would bring back from India. Notice in the bottom left corner, shellac. Everybody know about the lac beetle, which gives us shellac or varnish. That came from India. Silk textiles from India, and Chinese porcelain in the right box from India. Not that they went all the way to China for the silk and the porcelain, but these Chinese products had reached India and then they could be transported back to Egypt and there to Europe. And cotton, the homeland of cotton is India. Cotton is grown around the world now, including in the US, of course, but the cotton plant is native to India. And since you're stopping off in Yemen anyway, we'll pick up some local products there, some African ivory, some coconuts, some myrrh and frankincense from that region of the Horn of Africa and South Arabia. This is all laid out for us in the Cairo-Geniza documentation. Now, what's the problem with sailing from Aden to India? If you go due east, you'll hit India, no problem. Or you can hug the coast and go to what is more or less South Pakistan today, also fine. Who's out there in the Indian Ocean? And you know the answer, pirates. What are you gonna do? Carry all your gold and your silver and your money with you? What if the pirates hit you? So what do? You develop international banking. These are checks. These are the oldest checks in the world. In other words, Jews had figured out a finance system. And these are three checks written by the same person in the year 1140, 1141, two of them at JTS, one of them in Manchester. And these are money orders by the same person. I don't know the difference in the check and the money order. I'm not an expert on medieval economy, but he instructs his banker to deliver the funds necessary for the purchase of the raisins and the grapes and so on. International banking. You in New York are in the center. You are in the financial capital, not only of America, but of the world, where everything gets traded. And of course, there's no real money going anywhere because it's all through checks or nowadays online and so on and so forth, money transfers. Here you have 1,000 or 900 years ago, the system in place. How do you access this material? All 300,000 documents are now cataloged at the Friedberg-Geniza Project website, which you see here, funded by Albert Friedberg of Toronto. And I did the pull down menu. You can see there are 3 collections in New York, JTS by far the largest of the New York ones, smaller collections at Columbia and YU. I end with Johannes of Oppido, a person dear to my heart. Johannes was born a Catholic in southern Italy, small town of Oppido, in around the year 1070. He entered the Catholic priesthood, but he converted to Judaism in the year 1102. It was not a smart move for a Catholic monk to convert to Judaism and remain in heavily Catholic Italy in the 12th century, as you can imagine. And so he left and he headed east. And he went to Iraq, Syria, and Israel, and he eventually settled in Cairo. And he wrote a memoir in Hebrew. He mastered Hebrew. He wrote a memoir in Hebrew, and he wrote his own Siddur, and all of these documents wound up in the Cairo Geniza. And so we now know the life of this remarkable man, Johannes of Oppido, small town in southern Italy. If you can picture the map, halfway between Naples on the west coast and Bari on the east coast. And in fact, my wife and I visited in 2019. We actually visited the town of Oppido. It was my life dream to reach this town. He changed his name to Ovadia or Obadiah. And as I said, he traveled. Here's his memoir, a portion of it. There are 14 pages of text scattered in Budapest, Cambridge, and New York at JTS. And my most recent digital humanities project was to reunite all of these, just like I did for the Ben Sira documentation. I did it for this as well with another one of my Rutgers honors students. And there is a picture of the Siddur that he wrote, which is at HUC Cincinnati. So it's an incredible story about which we would have known nothing without the Cairo Geniza documentation. But that's just the beginning. He also did the following. He set Hebrew prayers to Gregorian chant. He took Hebrew prayers, and what you're looking at here is Baruch HaGever Sheyeftach Badonai from the book of Jeremiah, and he set it to Gregorian chant, the musical traditions of his church from his youth. And musicologists, you see the musical notation? Musicologists have read this and have invited Gregorian chant people to record it. And let's have a listen. Let's hope the audio works here. We are not only the people of the book, but as we learn from the Cairo Geniza, we are also the people of the music sheet. Thank you, Johannes, for your remarkable contribution to Jewish life and Jewish society 900 years ago. If you want to hear the full recording, it's embedded, the audio file is embedded at the website I just showed you. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to share this with you. And again, let's open it up to all manner of questions.
Let me just speak. Dr. Rendsburg, I heard a podcast with Rebecca Jefferson, who claimed that but many of the things are not really in that space, but in the walls.
In the what?
In the walls. And when they redid the synagogue in the the last redoing, that's when they found all these documents. Right.
Okay. I'm trying to multitask here. Let me put into the chat real quickly the links for the trip. There is a video, there is the full itinerary, and there is the link to the travel company's website. Okay.
Dr. Rendsburg, will you please stop the share of your screen? We see the Google dashboard.
Oh,
Now we're all on screen together. Good.
Okay, my
Excellent.
apologies, right. So there I've just put into the chat for anybody who wants to capture that material. I have just completed reading Rebecca Jefferson's book. I was going to actually put it up when I showed the other two books. Rebecca Jefferson did her PhD in Cambridge, and she is a librarian at the University of Florida, Judaica librarian. She has just written a wonderful book on how all of this material came to be discovered. I will not contest anything that Rebecca may have said, and I have to tell you that even after reading her book, I still have to go back and reread it. You're absolutely right. The narrative I gave you is the standard narrative. She thinks that this was exactly the time when the synagogue was being renovated in the 1890s. So it's still unclear where the material actually came from. That little hole in the wall, or inside other portions of the wall. Down the street, there's a cemetery. We know some of it came out of the cemetery. All of this is still unclear. So thanks for raising that. And yes, her book is wonderful.
Great.
Where, as you can imagine, Solomon Schechter plays a major role.
Barry and Bobby.
Thank you so much for this illuminating and brilliant talk. I wanted to ask you, I'm surprised that Maimonides' material is in this area of discarded things. Was he not respected enough for people to treasure and keep his handwritten words?
Okay. If you come with me to Oxford this summer, I will show you Maimonides' complete commentary of the Mishnah, written in his own hand. That was handed down through the generations of people in the Maimonides family, and that we still have, and it's in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. I will also show you Maimonides' Code of Jewish Law, which he did not write in his own hand. A professional scribe wrote it, but his signature is on it, in which he states that I approve of this copy. It's been checked against my own personal copy. So the documents that I showed you are drafts. They're only drafts. The actual one that he wrote or that a professional scribe wrote in his lifetime, we still have, right? So those have been honored and eventually made it into major libraries, in this case, Oxford. And there's also, by the way, similar material at the National Library of Israel in Jerusalem. So all of that was honored. But a draft is just some, even from the pen of the respected Maimonides. In his lifetime, he was already known as the great scholar. A draft is only a draft. And I think that's true. You know, any of you who've ever written anything, you know, I don't know how, you know, Rabbi Bolton prepares his sermons today, you know, on the back of the envelope, but they'll keep the real ones for sure forever. But, you know, the back of the envelope, that goes into the recycle bin nowadays, I assume. Okay, does that help answer your question? It's a good question.
It does, but I deal with art, and an artist's sketch is also very valuable when it's a very respected and revered artist. So
yeah, and you know, look what we learned from these drafts. We saw where he crossed stuff out, where he added stuff in the margins. We can actually compare it against the actual text that was transmitted to us. So, you know, the experts who work in Maimonides' halachic material, philosophical material, have obviously done exactly what I've just described for you. But aren't we fortunate to have, you know, what we do have, you know, the final copies, including in his own hand, that are now in libraries and passed down for 800 years, and the draft, which just went into the Cairo Geniza. Yeah.
I'd like to also thank you for a fantastic presentation. I have a question about if there's any correspondence there about Jewish communities in India. I know that there were several Jewish communities established there, but I think the scholarship is still pretty incomplete. And I was wondering if there's any documentation of the Jewish communities in India with which they traded.
Right. Great question. We do, of course, know of Jews in that part of India, specifically in that part of India called Kerala. Many of them, there's still a Jewish community there. Many of them moved to Israel in the 60s. I mean, many. We're not talking about a huge migration because we're, like Moroccan Jews or Russian Jews, because we're talking about such a small community to begin with. But I don't know if these documents, and it's a great question, which I'll explore. I don't know if these documents actually refer to the Jews there or not, or they're just economic trading documents, and it's not clear who the traders are on the other end. But we do have, I'm pretty sure, in the 1200s, I believe it is, we have a Spanish Jewish scholar, Benjamin of Tudela, who traveled all the way, I believe, to India. He went to Afghanistan. I think he went to India as well. And he talks about Jewish communities, at least in Central Asia, if not in India as well. So there is some documentation of these Jewish communities already there in the Middle Ages. Whether these economic texts say, my trade partner was Jewish or Christian or Hindu or something, that I don't know.
Mark, Ashley.
Professor, you've made clear that a lot of the trash that was found in the Cairo Geniza was not actually sacred, that it contained contracts and other financial instruments. Do we have reason to believe that other Genizas around the world contain similar material? And do you and other scholars have any hope that other significant Geniza materials could be recovered elsewhere?
Okay, well, thank you for that question. There's two things that we can to which I can speak. And I didn't even enter into this, and I figured somebody would ask it, and you've done it. Why would somebody's trousseau list or a letter to the caliph or these economic documents documenting the trade, they don't need to go into a Geniza? Everybody understand the point, right? Bible, Talmud, Siddur, all those books that I see behind Rabbi Bolton and those of you in the Beit Midrash with him, if they were worn out, we would put them in a Geniza. But, yesterday's shopping list, do we really need to keep that? So nobody knows how or why those wound up in the Geniza. A couple of theories. One is anything written in Hebrew script may have seemed to have some sort of, sanctity to it and therefore couldn't be disposed of, even if it was Arabic material in Hebrew script, like many of the documents that I showed you. That's one theory. The other one is, and this is what the director of the research unit in Cambridge likes to say, when Uncle Saul died and they cleared out the house, the children didn't bother to go through. They just took all the documents and they just said to the synagogue, here, put them in the Geniza. How's that for an answer? Right? And so 90% of it is sacred material. And 10% of it, which is 30,000 documents, that's quite a bit, right, are what we call documentary evidence about the social, economic lives of Jews and others in medieval Cairo. Those are the two responses we typically give. But thank you, Uncle Saul. Thank you, Uncle Saul's children or niece and nephew who didn't dispose of them, who put them in the Geniza for us.
Just on
including his checks, which are no longer necessary anymore.
Just on the second part of Mark's question, are there other discoveries about potential sites for Genizas or other Genizas that either have brought us material or that we really wish we could get permits to, take apart walls or dig down into?
The answer is always hope, especially in places with dry climate. You just can't go there today, but can you imagine what might be hiding in old Yemenite synagogues? But I'll tell you where we are finding material. When printing was developed in the 15th century, printers started printing in Germany, Italy, etc. They didn't need the old manuscripts anymore. But what they did need was good binding material. So they took layers of old manuscripts, sturdy parchment, and created binding material out of them. And there are all manner now of early printed books or documents. Anybody have a traditional file box? right? To keep all your documents in. My students have no idea what I'm talking about when I mention a file box to them, but you know what a file box, right? So you had these notaries in Europe who needed to wrap all that material up. They took old manuscript documents which were no longer required. Those are all now coming to light, especially in Italy, but elsewhere in Europe. And in other words, these are old manuscripts which were used as binding materials.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody following this story? We now have hundreds of these, many in Latin, many in Hebrew. Remember, the Jews were so much the people of the book that there would be disproportionately more Hebrew material than there were Jews in Europe. So they didn't need all these old things anymore, because now you can have a printed book. And it's a little bit like you and I today. Well, maybe not you and I, but many people getting rid of their printed books because they run out of book space, and everything's on our computers and on our devices now. And I can have a PDF file of the whole book. Why do I need or my e-reader? Why do I need the book taking up space? Although I do tell my students books are for Shabbat. And they understand it, whether they're observant or not. So these 15th, 16th century printers and notaries were just using old manuscripts, whatever they could, to wrap things up. And there's a whole worldwide project now, and I've done some of it myself, to identify these binding materials.
And with the new photography methods, we could even see them without having to unravel them, which is really cool. I once saw a presentation at the Katz Center at Penn about this photography methodology with the binding materials. Others with questions? Well, talk to us a little bit about your Ben Sira project. We know that Dr. Jenny Lebenz did work about the use of Ben Sira in the Talmud, and the idea that the sages had other literature. We talk about having Breitas and we talk about having outside literature, but Ben Sira happens to be a class all its own that maybe people didn't know about a little bit more, Gary. So if you would, yeah. Dr. give us a little bit more about that level of literacy and why you think it was kept in Greek a lot as a book, probably in Jewish libraries in Greek, by the way, right? Because for those who could read it, but maybe more Hebrew scrolls were out there and around. I don't know if we found other segments or fragments of Ben Sira elsewhere, and just why you made that the project you did.
Yeah, well, great, thanks. Well, we did find, to show you that Ben Sira was still very much a part of the Jewish world in the Roman period, there is a good sized chunk of Ben Sira found at Masada,
right? I thought
by Yegayadin, and 2 tiny bits found at Qumran amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it was still very much current. But when the when the canon was fixed, Ben Sira doesn't make the canon for reasons that are speculate, but it was canonized in the Christian world. But the rabbis knew the book, and in fact, occasionally cited it as if it were canonical. The Talmud will sometimes introduce it as with the words shene'emar in Hebrew or dichtiv in Aramaic, which are the way you introduce a biblical passage. So it was quasi-canonical maybe, but never makes it into the real canon of the 24 books. But they never lost sight of it. And yes, Jenny Lebenz wrote a wonderful article in which she collected all of the rabbinic citations through Sadja and maybe even later than that of the passages, so that we know that they had it and they know that they enjoyed the book. It's universal wisdom in there in the book of Ben Sira. And why did I create the website? I realized you could go look at all the documents at geniza.org, the website I showed you, but you'd have to click on every single one of them. And what I wanted to do was digitally reunite them so that you could just click along, and the same manuscript has its various folios at JTS, at Cambridge, in Paris. And so you can just sort of, turn the page, as it were, digitally here. And of course, I couldn't do all this work by myself. My honor student with whom I collaborated on this, the best honor student you could ever want for such a project, a double major in information technology and Jewish studies. That's who you need to do this kind of work, right? Jacob Binstein of Metuchen, New Jersey. So he gets a lot of credit for this. And then he also assisted on the other one, the Johannes of Oppido, with the final clip that I played for you. He was our technical consultant, but I did that with another one of my students, Peter Shama, now living in Jerusalem.
Wow, that's really cool. I think Jacob was actually a former student at Schechter, if I have that right.
Yes,
But,
yes, that's correct.
Yeah, so I want to push that issue further because you being an expert in all of the Ketiv and the Kri and the documents and the manuscripts and the going to England to hold them, and if you want to travel with someone who's going to bring insight, I said to Dr. Rendsburg, definitely share that you're taking this trip. These are once in a lifetime opportunities, really. And if you're not going to the chuppah on August 6th in the community, because I just feel like I have a responsibility to, share that and remind people that they got to really check their calendars right. But if you go, you're going to come back and you have to do a panel here about what that trip was all about. But I want to push this issue further. The digital humanities is a blossoming field. And while we have you here for a minute to talk about this intersection between ancient scroll technology still in use, the writing, the scribing, the personal writing of Hebrew documents that can make great meaning for someone in their prayer books, the inclusion of other languages like Arabic translations for prayers and using the lingua franca, but writing it out and having that be in relation to our spiritual lives. And now there's a whole level of digital interaction and interface with text. Do you feel like, how do you think about that as a scholar? I don't want to paint with a leading question. How do you think more about this idea that we're seeing text on screen, that we can create text on screen interchangeably with fragments on the screen? Where does your mind go with this level of now technology and sacred text?
Well, on the most basic level, I will tell you that every time I go to a daily minyan and somebody pulls out his or her device to read Mincha or Mariv on the phone, I'm still in shock, because I still like a book in my hands. Okay. It still, even after years of seeing it, it still shocks me, but okay. There is no limit to the field of digital humanities. Let me just give you one application. I'm not sure if this is what we're talking about, but I can just give you one application. We have 300,000 documents stored at geniza.org, the website I showed you. Almost 2/3 of them from Cambridge, right? And the 30,000 from JTS and so on and so forth. 20,000 from Oxford. So that's already 250,000 out of the 300,000, and then all the other libraries. We now have these machines. Bar Ilan is a couple of professors at Bar Ilan are the leaders in this technology. They are doing AI machine reading of the 300,000 documents to see if this fragment and this fragment in different libraries might match each other. Either because they join physically or because the handwriting is exactly the same, even if they don't join physically. Everybody following this? Right? It would take a lifetime of going through all of this material to figure that kind of things out. And these machines are doing it and making what we call joins. Then the scholar, by the way, the machine is trained to do this. I think it's false negative. Then the scholars come in and say, yes, it is a good one. Or they reject it. No, it's not. But if you did false positive, then you wouldn't get enough of them. So you do, I think it's called false negative or whatever the terminology is. It is remarkable. And we rely on all of these experts to do all of this work for us. And if you had told me when I did my PhD that I would be able one day to access every Geniza document, from my screen, and then I always quip, but I said it seriously. it's wonderful, but there is nothing like the physical experience of any manuscript, Cairo Geniza, or next week when we talk about the Kennecott Bible. There is nothing like holding these documents in your hand. And pre-pandemic, my wife and I would go to Oxford and Cambridge almost every summer to work in the libraries. That's how I know all of these librarians so well. But even as recently as February 2022, almost a year ago, we were in Oxford again. It was a little post-pandemic break, I guess. And again, spent several days working in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, reading documents. There is nothing like reading them and holding them, and the things you don't see. There's only so much you can do with staring at your screen, as you know. There's so much that you can do by holding these things. And I'll be back at the Vatican Library next month doing more of this work as well. I am blessed to have these opportunities to do this and to enter these libraries and know that you're holding something that Maimonides held or in fact wrote, or that, one of my treasures in Oxford is there's a female scribe named Paula Bat Avraham who wrote in the 1200s a manuscript that's in Oxford, meticulous handwriting. I treasure that document. So you can read these on the screen, but holding them in your hands, even the olfactory, just smelling them is an experience, right? This is my spiritual high to do this kind of work.
Great. Beautiful. Thank you for relating to that broader issue and personal relationship to these sacred sources and where the technology comes to help us see a big picture, the holistic nature of study with the technology. Who knows, that God grants us in the world has come to life through your hand and your heart and your mind. This has been so fantastic. A second installment. We have a third lecture with you next week. Everybody join back in. Thank you for coming this morning to this 2 of 3. And we wish everybody a Shavua Tov and Yishar Koach to you, Dr. Rendsburg, for fantastic engagement.
And thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Fabulous. Thank you.